Hey everyone, thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Out in the Open, Automating OSINT Collection for CTI, led by Daniel Ben-Sheetry, Senior Product Manager here at Authentic8. My name is Julie and I'll be your moderator today. I have a couple of housekeeping items to go over before we start the presentation. You'll see in your view of the webinar console a few different boxes with various actions associated. Please note that you can hide, minimize, and resize these boxes as you see fit. Just to call out a few, there is a Q&A box where you can submit questions to the speaker. We will be answering all of those questions at the end of the webinar, but feel free to submit those throughout. You will also find additional resources to support the webinar content in the box labeled Resource List. There is also a PDF of our presentation slide today for your download. And on the upper right side of your console, you'll see a box where you can request a demo to learn more. There's also a quick survey that we would appreciate if you'd fill out at the end of the webinar, just to let us know how we did and what future topics you guys might be interested in seeing. And now over to Daniel.
Thanks, Julie. And thanks everyone for joining. So before we begin, let's quickly go over the agenda. We'll start with an introduction of who I am, and then we'll move into a discussion on OSINT, automation, and how they work together in the world of CTI. We will then talk about some of the pitfalls to be wary of, how to practice safe automation, and we'll end with a case study to show how OSINT automation at scale might look like in the CTI world. So who am I? My name is Daniel Ben-Sheetry. I am the Senior Product Manager at Authentic8 for the research platform and all of the products related to that. I am a cybersecurity junkie. Avid researcher and scripter. I love food, beer, wine, and whiskey, and I have a Peloton. So, before we dive too deeply into OSINT and automation, let's talk about what we mean when we say automation. What is required to be considered automation, and what areas of automation are we going to be focusing on? So, generically, automation means something is being done automatically. This usually means limited manual input. With the less manual input, the better. But obviously, humans can and are many times involved in a variety of areas of automation. But the goal of automation really is to remove as much human interaction from the process as possible. Take this graphic, for example. While it seems like the robot, in this case automation, is better and doing better, it's actually doing something that's different than what the humans are doing. It's rolling a ball versus pushing a square. So we do need to be mindful of, automation and not automating the wrong thing to make sure that we understand what those limitations of automation are. For OSINT collection, or at least for this talk, we're going to define automation slightly different. While many areas of OSINT do have the capability to have full automation, and that is available, and it might even make sense to use, in general, there are going to be more human involvement or more manual involvement and therefore human involvement in OSINT collection, at least at the start of the process. Now, with CTI, the need for human involvement can be reduced further, as we are dealing with issues that might be more native to computers, and therefore automation could be a little bit easier. Why the difference, you might ask? Well, human input is probably the most important, if not one of the most important inputs for collection of OSINT. And that has to do with targeting and scoping of the collection, making sure you're collecting the right information. In CTI, many times we see that the input for the collection is actually triggered by an alert in either a SIM or a computer or something like that, which doesn't actually have any human intervention needed. So today, for today's talk, we're going to be focusing on the automation of the actual collection itself. Processing and analysis of data can also be automated, but we're not going to be focusing on those things for the talk. Automation of the inputs into the process, as I just mentioned, is possible, and we will talk about that in at least one common use case. but we're not going to focus on that way of automation only. So for today, we will consider something like an analyst putting something into a queue for automated monitoring or some sort of screenshotting as automated collection. We'll also take into account anything that is kicked off by a computer. Think like the sim saw use case for collection without any human involvement as automation as well. Something like having a analyst run a script manually or ad hoc to scrape websites, to take some screenshots, will not be considered automation. That's really more technology-enabled collection, which is something that we're going to be talking about, which we talk about at a different talk. So we just talked about automation. The other side is OSINT. Before I go too far into the areas of OSINT, let's briefly talk about what we mean when we say OSINT. So in case you didn't know, or if you're getting lost when I say the word OSINT, OSINT means open source intelligence. This really just means publicly available information, or PAI, which is something that does not require credentials, payment, paywall, or anything special to collect. It's out in the open. Now, that doesn't mean that some of these things could be behind paywalls, might require a free account to log in, or that there may not be special tools, skills, tactics, etc. related to that collection. It's just that you shouldn't have to use them to be able to get access to the data. They're not required. Now, remember, access is different than collection. Just because you can access the data without tools does not mean you can collect it without those tools. In many cases, you'll actually have to use some sort of tool to do that saving, to do that actual collection. OSINT does cover both digital and non-digital items. Think newspapers and magazines in the physical world, as well as online news sources, forums, pay sites in the digital world. A lot of times people think, oh, OSINT, that must be government, or that's the spooky government. But in reality, many of you are already probably using OSINT, even if you don't know it. So one of the things that we'd love to understand is, do you guys leverage automation in website content collection already? Do you automate your screenshotting in your workflows? Do you automate the download of things like malware, etc.? Many of these things would actually be considered OSINT collection already. And if you're already automating, that's a good first step. So please take a minute to answer the question, then we'll see what the results look like. So I'll give it another couple seconds. So before we actually look at the results, it's really important to understand, even if you aren't automating some of these things at this point, but your analysts are going out and doing it, the fact that you have this type of content collection as a need means that automation might be something that is useful for you and your teams to think about. Is, are we doing a lot of repetitive tasks? Are we doing things that we could automate? Those are the questions we definitely need to ask ourselves as analysts and as researchers to make sure we're saving our precious time. So I'll go to I think we have just over 60% have responded. So we'll see what the results look like. And it's exactly what I thought. We have a lot of people who are using it. There's a lot of people who would like to add it into their workflows. And then there's a lot of people who they haven't gotten to it potentially. Maybe they're doing some very specific collections that can't be automated because you do need that human access. You need that login credential type capability. And then there's a lot of people who just don't know about automation. And that's why we're doing this talk, is because there's a lot of information out there that people just don't know exists. So we talked about OSINT a little bit. We see that we have a lot of people using automation, but there's a lot of people that aren't using automation. So how does OSINT automation and CTI kind of connect? So and what part are we going to focus on for today's talk specifically? So I love this graphic because one of the things that many people don't realize is that while OSINT is a large area of intelligence itself, everything from cyber threat and persons of interest to financial crimes and more, it really has grown with technology so that it overlaps with most, if not all, other areas of intelligence right now. And you'll see in this, GeoInt, Human, SIGINT, all of these have some sort of connection to OSINT now. For this talk, we're going to really be focusing on the cyber threat intelligence, obviously, part of OSINT, but also some of the areas that may fall into cyber threat intelligence in your organizations, but in other organizations could fall into things like business intelligence, brand and fraud protection, as well as general OSINT collection for collateral and things that might not be related directly to either a fraud business intel or a cyber intel use case, but there still could be value in automating. It does mean open source, right? So we are talking OSINT, but we are going to be focusing on the passive collection. So the need for sock puppets, accounts, logins, credentials won't really relate directly to what we're talking about. There is going to be a lot of overlap, and you can use a lot of the techniques and tools we're going to be talking about today to do that type of collection as well. It's just that there's going to be a lot more nuance, potentially several additional steps needed to connect the sock puppet, persona, non-passive collection into this. The other piece is that we're going to be focusing on online collection. So I did mention the non-digital aspect of OSINT, but for today, the automation is going to really just be looking at web and website-based information. Think everything from screenshots to the actual web server assets and additional assets like videos. So while we are focusing on OSINT collection, I do want to just talk about automation in general when we think about data science and data analysis. So this graphic is also really good at showing you all of the different steps that might be needed in data analysis in general. You start with identification of the information you need, and you end with results and dissemination. So we know that the start of the process frequently will have some sort of human input or require some level of manual effort because you do need to know what sources you're collecting. Now, we did talk about some of the ways to automate that within the cyber threat world, but in general, humans will tend to be in the loop more frequently at the start. The last piece, the last step, results dissemination, can also easily be automated, but it could also require some human involvement depending on what the output is, how the output has to be disseminated or created. But we are really going to focus on the middle three boxes. So, automation in general comes in three different flavors when we talk about data science, data analytics in OSINT. You got collection or harvesting of the data, which is, again, going to be the focus for today. You have post-processing of the data, and you have analysis of the data. To put it simply, automation can really help you gather the data you need and make it easier to access, make the data that is collected usable and easy to understand, and it allows you to garner insight and value, an additional value from the collected data. There are some examples of how automation relates to each of these three areas of automation on the slide, and there are many more that I just couldn't fit onto the slide that you may be aware of. And you also might notice some of these examples tend to overlap, especially when we look at the post-processing bullet, because processing of data does happen at each of these stages, just like storage of data may occur at all of these stages as well. So while we will touch on processing a little bit during the talk, we, again, are going to be focusing on the collection and not the post-processing or data analysis and automation related to that. I do want to mention, though, that automation of all steps of the process together is possible, but it can be very, very difficult because it tends to be that each flavor has its unique difficulties when it comes to automation. While post-processing of non-standard data and information can be difficult to automate, everyday technologies around that are getting better and they are improving. So it is becoming easier and easier to do as time goes on. Now, processing of standard or homogeneous machine-readable data can be more easily automated. And I highly recommend, if you do work with highly homogeneous data or easy for machines to work on data, to look at adding that post-processing automation to your workflow in addition to the collection, because it can save you a lot of time and it can heavily reduce the amount of human involvement if you're not leveraging that currently. Now, processing of data is getting better, and so is automation of the analysis of data. But it can also be like opening a can of worms. From the same complexities that relate to the non-standard data post-processing, think image recognition as an example, artificial intelligence and machine learning, these are all the big buzzwords that, we can do all this automation because we're using machine learning or artificial intelligence. But a lot of the times, and in most cases, the juice just isn't worth the squeeze. There's always going to need to be some human involvement even after you run the artificial intelligence or machine learning on top of the analysis. The great example I like to use is think of malware sandboxing. You can definitely sandbox the malware. You can get the report out. You can triage the report with some levels of automation. But in general, you're going to need that analyst, that malware analyst, to look at the output of the sandbox and figure out what they need to do and disseminate that information downstream, whether that is in a system like a SOAR platform or in a physical report that is handed to other people. And we could definitely spend the whole talk on each of these other two areas of automation. So let's talk about collection, because that is going to be the focus for today. Many believe this is the easiest area to automate, and the actual collection itself in general is going to be easier just due to the vast number of methods and tools that are out there and the extremely low barrier to entry when we think about open source data, because it's just, again, out there, it's publicly available. There are many areas of collection in the open source that are harder than others. I like to always think about collection of videos can be very difficult depending on who's hosting those videos. And some level of human intervention might be needed for targeting or source identification. But once you have a majority of these things defined, automation can easily take over the day-to-day work. It's also just very important to note that tuning the collection is going, and to make sure you get the right information is critical when we think about automating collection. Firehose style data collection just doesn't work well in many cases. And then you're going to end up filtering the data down to what you need, which could take more time and effort than actually doing the tuning of the collection at the start. So why are we even talking about automation of OSINT collection in CTI? You must think if it's easy, that must be the only reason why we're going to be using this automation. And that's just wrong. Sure, the low barrier of entry, the vast number of tools out there, the time-saving benefits, these are all reasons to use it, but it's not the only reason to be using automation when it comes to OSINT and CTI. Let's think of some of the common issues that we come across in OSINT and in cybersecurity in general. I'm sure we all know that the surface, deep, and dark web are quite large, especially when you add them all together. So mainly trying to collect data from all these different sources, it's very time consuming. And there are potentially bigger issues like missing key data, not collecting sources that you'd like to be collecting, and missing out on information that's just no longer available just due to the time constraints. So while automation is not a silver bullet, it's not going to solve all of these issues, such as if you don't know a source, you can't automate the collection of that source. If the automation does run after something is removed, you still won't have access to it. But what automation does do is it allows you to more quickly collect that data, limiting the likelihood that it might be removed before you can collect it. And it also allows you to more easily target all of the sites that you know about and have interest in collecting. You're not limited by the analyst's bandwidth. You're limited by computer speed, which is much, much greater than analyst bandwidth. So you can not only collect more, but you can collect it at a higher frequency. On the opposite end of the CTI space, you have the highly specific analyst-driven collections. And as it says on the slide, and I'm sure we're all aware, analysts are already short on time. So we want to limit the highly specific analyst-driven collections when we can. But without the data, the analysts can't do their jobs. If your job is to do analysis on collected data and you don't have the data, you can't do that job. So they end up spending most of their time going out and collecting the information manually so that they can do the analysis after. As we just mentioned, manual collections cause other issues like missing data. And from the analyst point of view, if you think about it, deadlines, fast-moving incidents, all of these things just exacerbate those collection issues. So again, automation might not fix this completely. There's always going to be some level of manual collection needed for very sensitive or very, very specific collections. But building your collection around automation for the day-to-day of the analyst will not only save the analyst the time, but it will actually improve the output of the analysis because they can actually spend more time on the analysis instead of spending their time on the collection. So similar to the analysis example, I just want to talk about something that is becoming more and more common, and that's going international. We have a lot of, the boundaries of the internet are very broad now. It's not just the US or Europe, it's international. So a lot of times analysts have to worry about collecting data at regionally appropriate times or in the future to make sure that they blend in, that they get the right information, etc. Being able to automate that future type of collection just will save analysts time and stress, just not having to wake up. So there are some small benefits to just automating the things that you will be doing in the future. And then the last item is the automation around time to remediation. If you want to speed up time to remediation, you have to add automation into your workflow. If every time something comes in, an analyst has to go out, find the information, collect the information, and then do the remediation after, you're wasting precious time. And this is really one of the biggest, if not the biggest, issues in cybersecurity and threat intelligence right now. The example I like to always use is the malware example. A new malware strain is found. So we need to get the IOCs. We need to get the command and control. We have to see if we're compromised. We have to see what signatures are out there. And really, we've seen the rise of SOAR platforms step in to help with this. There are many moving parts when it comes to threat intelligence, and the ability to actually collect the OSINT-related artifacts, think malicious files in that malware example, and other supporting information is critical to incident response. Without automation, you can run into a lot of those issues we've previously talked about, but now it's almost worse because you're not solving the problem. You're letting the problem sit and potentially get worse while you're out collecting the information. OSINT cybersecurity is growing, so I expect to see many, many more of these types of use cases and more advanced use cases growing over time. So before we actually dive into the SOAR example, I'd like to see, how many of you guys have SOAR platforms? I do know it's, might not be something you're currently evaluating, but it might be something you're looking to add into your SOC. So, we'd love to understand if you are already using one, if you're planning to be using one in the future, or if it doesn't even fit into your mission set, that you don't even need a SOAR platform. So I'll wait for a minute to see what information we can get from the group. Looks like we have about 40%, so I'll give it another 15 seconds or so. Looks like we got a good response, so I'll continue to kind of see. So it's actually, this is very surprising. I know that a lot of organizations haven't moved into the automation and haven't gotten SOAR platforms, but I'm surprised to see such a large percentage of you guys don't really have that yet. And I definitely recommend looking into it. I think there are lots of benefits. We are not a SOAR platform, but I do know, talking to many of our customers, that they've seen a lot of benefits from moving in and from implementing SOAR platforms into their workflow. So definitely encourage looking at how that could potentially help some of your workflows. So I do want to dive a little bit further into the SOAR, or automation, the SOC use case when it comes to OSINT collection. And again, SOAR is probably one of the hottest topics in the cybersecurity space right now. It's been growing over the last 5 years or so, and we have seen in a lot of our customers that there's been a lot of adoption around SOAR or SOA, which without the remediation piece recently. So one of the things we have come across with those customers and companies that we've talked to is the desire to now start to leverage the vast amount of information that's just available out in the open. A lot of the times they focused initially on the connection of firewalls and IDPS systems and malware sandboxing, and once they've gotten that core completed, they're now looking at what's out in the open, what can I get from that. We've heard customers asking about screenshots of pages, to being able to automate the download of the malicious payloads off of their networks, collection of credentials or CVE information. Their thought is, the more information I have and get as much information as I possibly can, the better my analysts can do their job. And we have seen some real benefits doing that. Much of the SOAR SOC automation, work really is focused on the event triage and trying to automate the response to events. But as time has gone on, I think a lot of organizations have realized that they're not going to be able to remove the analyst from the loop. It's not something that's easily done. So this really has led to a desire to integrate more and more analyst tools for OSINT collection and for SOC use cases in general into their SOAR platforms. And that's exactly where we think OSINT collection really fits in when we think about the SOC use cases, the SOAR automation orchestration use cases. There's a lot I could discuss around OSINT and SOAR specifically, but one of the areas that we've actually seen some interesting movement around with SOAR specifically is the use of SOAR for automated monitoring. And OSINT automation and OSINT collection in general fits in perfectly there. Once something is remediated, we want to make sure that it stays that way, it stays remediated. Phishing websites are a great example. Take a screenshot of the phishing website every day, make sure the phishing website didn't come back. We may have taken it down once, but we need to make sure it stays down. And OSINT automation can really enable that. So we talked about automation of the collection, but that's really just half the battle. We have to talk about storage as well. There are a lot of questions you have to ask yourself about storage. Where do you want to store all your information? And to start, you have to think, how safe and how sensitive are the data being collected? If you're thinking about collecting malicious information, obviously you should be looking at segmented storage and segmented networks. The same goes for targeting advanced cyber criminals. I always recommend using dirty networks and segmented storage because you don't know what you're going to get into when you're doing web asset collection. The web can be a dangerous place. And sometimes, even when you think the collections are going to be safe, there's a chance something malicious could be lurking in the shadows. So risk tolerance is really important here. If you have a really low risk tolerance in a regulated industry, let's say, then using segmented storage and segmented networking, it's going to be what you should be doing because you can't take the risk of something going wrong. Now, that will increase the level of effort needed for both sustaining the automation and the downstream analysis, especially if you're working with data that might be coming from a clean network as well as that dirty network. But risk tolerance is really what you're going to have to understand before you pick the storage solution. And the other piece, to quickly touch on, is the type of storage that you might need. If you're looking at homogeneous data, just files, Excel spreadsheets, text data, you might want to pick a different storage solution than if you're working with blob data, image data, databases, or a variety of different files. The last piece is encryption. If you are dealing with sensitive information, one, it doesn't have to be encrypted, and if it does, you have your answer for it. But even if it doesn't have to be encrypted, you should think about how can I best protect the sensitive data. There is a performance impact when you encrypt data, but as time has gone on, technology has reduced that impact when it comes to encryption. The one thing to note for third parties, and this is where we get into the hiding of the automation, is if someone is providing storage or providing solutions, make sure that they're not putting the onus on you and that they're doing some of the storage. The same thing goes with automation, obfuscation. So before we get into the how you might add automation in with the use case that I mentioned previously, I do want to talk about managing your fingerprint, managing your footprint, reducing attribution, and hiding the activities that you might be doing with automation. Well, many of you, I'm sure, listening, we all use good tradecraft. We're all smart about what we're doing. We make sure we have a good fingerprint, that our online footprint is small when we're doing manual investigations and collections. That doesn't necessarily mean we are doing the same when it comes to automation. Some people who are setting up the automation might be non-analysts, and they might not know about these things, or they might not just think about adding these capabilities in when they set up the automation. So if you're not going to use a third-party solution to run your automation, there are a number of things you have to think about, from dirty and unattributed networks to rotation of IPs in networks to make sure you don't get blocked, to capabilities around browser fingerprinting and user agents. So using a third-party automation solution doesn't always solve all of these issues, but even if it doesn't, it usually gives you that extra layer of protection, especially when it comes to obfuscation back to your organization. Worst case, you would obfuscate back to the third party you are using. So no matter the solution that you're using, you have to ask yourself some questions. Do I have access to the right locations, to blend into what the collection I'm trying to do is? Am I trying to collect something from the Ukraine, but coming out of a node in Kansas City? That would obviously look very weird. Do I have enough control over what my session looks like to make sure that my session looks normal for the place I'm coming out of? What's the number one used browser? What version of that browser should I be looking like I'm coming from? Does the network that you're using have any relation back to your organization? If you're setting it up yourself, that is something you really have to worry about. And even if you are using a third party, and you have to make sure that still can relate back to you. And it's not just for sensitive collections. You also have to think about it from things like malware spread. We've seen malware being able to spread through VMs, and if it does have connections back to your enterprise network, there is a risk that you might be taking. And the last thing to think about is, do my collections look too robotic? Third parties, though, they should be able to provide you information about this. But if you are building an internal solution, you are going to have to work very closely with your operations and networking teams to make sure that you aren't going to get continually blocked. Just remember, the basic precautions can do a lot when it comes to automation. You don't need to go over the top. You don't need to check all of the boxes. As we say at Authentic8, who are you trying to fool? So now let's dive into automation using a real-life example. So over the years, one area I've been fascinated with in the world of cybersecurity is newly registered domains. There is just so much information that can be gathered by just monitoring what domains are being registered. So I decided, let's use a little OSINT automation to find some interesting information related to these new domains. And boy, did we find some really interesting information. Now, before I dive into the actual findings themselves, I do want to give an overview of what we did and how we did it. So we came into this focusing on phishing domains with respect to the newly registered domains we were looking at. And because we were focusing on phishing, time was of the essence. Phishing websites are notorious for going up quickly, I think 24 to 48 hours, and being blocked or taken down within a week or two. So I took one day of newly registered domains, specifically January 3rd, and I looked at all the domains that had the word bank in them. So this reduced the list of about 50,000 domains down to about 150 domains, so a much more manageable sample size. We know finance tends to be targeted heavily, so we thought the word bank would be a good example to use for this, and we were right. So I wanted to track and monitor these domains, so I came to my team at Authentic8. We set up a system to run the automation. We took a web harvesting API, set it to collect visual images of each of the websites based on the domains we collected. And then we leveraged our segmented and encrypted storage to store the data and used our automated malware scanning to make sure the files were safe before we actually downloaded to a local system for analysis. We wanted to see what websites were down and how that changed over the course of a week or two. You know, we also wanted to track websites that got blocked and then unblocked, or vice versa, as well as how websites might have changed over a period of time. Did a parked page get content later? Did a site that wasn't up get a parked page at another point in time, etc. So went into setting up the automation with some basic tenets, which I just covered across a lot of different things. So luckily, the API we are using allowed for some granular control over what our fingerprint looked like. So we knew we were going to be dealing with some obvious bad sites. One of the example domains we had was chasebank.xyz. So we made sure we only collected screenshots and images. We didn't try to download any assets of the website because there could have been something malicious lurking there, and we didn't want to have to deal with that. We also knew people could be watching the websites that we were going to be monitoring. So we made sure to rotate our locations, and we mostly focused on the continental US, but we also did do some European locations as well. We tracked the responses we got every day, and for every domain we were monitoring, so we could see how things changed over time. And we leveraged our encrypted storage to just host all of the data, so we didn't have to worry about the high volume of data we might be getting. We also changed browser fingerprints, specifically like our user agents, between requests to make sure the collections did not have any clear linking in case we ran into an actor hosting multiple websites on our list. And we actually did run into at least a couple websites that were being hosted by the same person. And then on a day-to-day, we rotated those fingerprints to make sure that the same request fingerprint wasn't happening at the same time every day. And we randomized the times in the order that we went and visited the websites so that it wasn't us going with the exact same user agent at the exact same time to the website every day over 2 weeks. So as I mentioned, we started with about 150 domains. They all had the word bank in them. So over the course of 2 weeks, we saw some interesting things. And these numbers are roughly where we ended up at the end of our monitoring. So about 20%, not 20%, like 20 of the domains were obvious phishing websites. So that's about 15% of the domains that we targeted. It's not too surprising since we did take a pretty basic term in a very highly phished industry, but we were easily able to determine 15% of these domains were phish. We also were able to validate that 20 of the websites were normal, valid websites, and about 20 of the other websites just weren't live. This is not really surprising since we did limit our research to a short period of time, and we would expect a good percentage, 10, 15, 20% of the domains to be valid websites that people needed to register on that day. The 5 weird websites were really interesting to me, especially. Mainly, we saw things like just showing a file system, or we saw malicious websites that were not phish, they were just downloading malware, or something that looked fishy, but that we could actually confirm it as a phish without spending a lot more time checking. And unfortunately, we didn't have the time to go in and dive into those websites. The rest of the websites were just pug pages, domains for sale, as you would expect with a majority of newly registered domains. So if you think about it, 100 or so of the 150 domains were just pug pages. And that's what you're going to really come across when you do this type of research. So looking at these statistics, some interesting things we noted. So one of the things was websites that were not available one day were available the next day as a phish. This actually includes some websites that were immediately blocked. We're talking about day one, they got blocked for looking like a phish. But then the following day or 2 days later, that website was marked clean. But when we looked at that website, it was still clearly a phishing website. We saw a couple duplicate websites, basically the same name with or different banks, the same web layouts with just different colors, different logos, etc. By no means did we cover all of the information that we collected, or all of the ways that automation could have actually been used in this specific use case. But I think it's a great way to just view the capabilities. Now, if I had more time, I would love to have dived deeper into the additional ways we could have leveraged automation in this use case, as well as all of the different ways we might be able to go about collecting other web assets, interacting with these websites in a different manner, and doing analysis of the code. In this case, we were talking about phishing websites. I would love to have looked at these phishing websites to see, do they have any common phishing kits, or do they share phishing kits across? So hopefully, this example illuminates some of the ways that you can implement automation in your OSINT collection, both at a small scale like I just did, but also all the way up to more mass OSINT type collections. Think data science. So I do just want to finish by briefly talking about the tool I used for this use case. So the Authentic8 Harvester API is an extension of a Silo for Research platform. So if you're familiar with our platform, a lot of the capabilities are still available in the Harvester API. It's just built for automated web-based collection. So the API allows for control over a variety of key attribution requirements that we've previously talked about, such as egress location to the internet, the browser fingerprint manipulation like user agents, and access to a secure encrypted storage. It also allows for a variety of web content collection, everything from wget style mass asset collection for a website, get all of the HTML, JavaScript images that are being hosted, to visual screenshots, which is what we use for the use case I just talked about, to individual video collection and download, think YouTube videos. This capability allows you and us to actually integrate this type of automated collection into your existing workflows and automation initiatives. The SOAR example, as I mentioned, would be a great way to connect this API into a SOAR platform to automate some of those those things. So if you do have any questions about this capability or would like any more information, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be more than happy to get you that information. So before we get to any questions, I do want to just ask one last question. So based on what we talked about today and what we learned today, what percentage of web-based collections do you think you actually could use to automate in your job? Do you think it's minimal, the 0 to 25%, or do you think it's something that 99% or almost 100% of your day-to-day, non-highly specific collection tasks could be automated? Or is it somewhere in between? So again, I'll give another minute or so for some answers, and then we can see how automation might fit in. That's a great point. We should have added like a non-applicable option to our poll questions. But you could also just put that as 0. If it doesn't apply to you or to your work, your day-to-day, feel free to use the 0 to 25. So it looks like we got just over 50%. So I'll give another 10 seconds or so to let anyone else come back in. So, and this is kind of what we expected. A lot of the bottom half, there's a lot that can be automated, but for a lot of people, until you've actually implemented it into workflow, we see that it's usually about 50% of the day-to-day tasks can usually be automated. And this has to do with a lot of the highly specific analyst-driven collections that we've seen from a lot of our customers and a lot of companies we've talked to. A lot of the times on the SOAR SOC use case, the percentage is going to be a little bit higher versus the average analyst usually is being tasked with much more specific, highly manual collections. So this does make sense, but it's great to see that, it looks like about 50% or so, just over, do see that at least a quarter, if not more, of the web-based collection could be automated. So that's just really good to see. So I wanted to thank you for listening. And I would love to take any questions that you guys have. And if not, here is my contact information. So please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, send me an email, connect with me about any questions, or if you want to learn more. So thank you for the time.
So as a reminder, feel free to submit any questions you have in our Q&A box, and we will go over those. So in the meantime, we've received a couple of questions, Daniel. So first, during your testing, did you get blocked? And if so, how did you mitigate the blocking?
So we did occasionally get blocked. We did do a lot of the rotation of IPs and user agents, which did help us not get blocked as frequently as we would expect using a static IP, using our enterprise IP, or a static user agent. We built into our system the ability to retry. So if we did get blocked, we rotated the IP, we rotated the user agent, and some of the other fingerprinting pieces, and then we actually set it to run a couple minutes later to make sure that we didn't just keep getting blocked.
So it sounds like, did you burn the IP you were using?
No, we didn't burn the IP. What we did is we potentially triggered something, whether it's the blocking that the adversary might be using. It could just be that the content was not available in that location. If we were coming from a US node, but it only was available for EU nodes, there are a lot of different reasons that you could get blocked for this type of thing.
Another question. Does the way you implemented the collection scale to thousands of domains instead of hundreds, like you show in your use case example?
Yeah, it definitely does. The API we use does support thousands of requests. It will do gigabytes of data back. So there's no issues there. The way we actually implemented it could scale up. It would just take a little bit longer. We did put some longer waits between the requests just to make sure that we weren't over processing any of the data. But yes, it could easily scale.
Okay, looks like last question we have for now. For store type automation, how do I know which egress and parameters to use for that collection?
That's a really good question. So that's one of the things that we kind of talked about is having the ability to be granular when it comes to egress location, browser fingerprint, etc. The way we recommend leveraging that is either using a variety of different ones and just picking from it. So you think you have a pool of 10 different egress locations, you pick one at random. The same thing could go with like a user agent, and that's what we did in our use case. But if you do have additional information, like if you know that this phishing site is coming from Brazil, use a South American egress location is probably the best. So if you do have that context, you do have the ability to do that. And a lot of the times you can create that automation in SOC, in the SOC SOAR use case by customizing the integration itself. But if you don't, we just recommend using a variety of different egresses, user agents, and browser fingerprints, just so you don't use the same one every single time.
Okay, and what sort of randomizing the time of access was used? A flat distribution over time, Gaussian distribution, or other?
So it wasn't actually, it was other. I used Python to do the scripting on the back end, and I just used the random feature that you get with Python to add a random wait before I kicked off the next.
Okay, it looks like that's the end of our questions. If you guys have any more questions, feel free to submit those in the box. We have a couple of more minutes. Just a few minor reminders before we close out. We ask that you fill out that survey in the panel. It really helps us tailor our webinar content specifically to topics that are of interest to you guys. We do have an upcoming webinar coming up on April 15th. It's an introductory webinar on managed attribution. Naked and exposed. Stop investigating online without managed attribution. So that should be a really great webinar. Be sure to click the Register Now button in the bottom at the upcoming webinar box if you're interested in joining us for that webinar. And if you're interested in a live demo, if you click on the Requested Demo button in the box, we'll reach out to you and get that scheduled. You can also answer the demo request question in the survey, and we'll reach out to you to get that scheduled. So it looks like we don't have any other questions. So with that, that concludes our webinar for today. Thank you for joining, and have a great day.